Have you heard about the Hear Me Out cakes? It's a trend where people put pictures of people and characters they find attractive on a cake. The idea is to share your unusual crushes, the ones not everyone finds attractive. So it's very common to see a bunch of characters that aren't human on these cakes. For example, they included Melvin from Choco Krispies, David Jones, Lightning McQueen, Arbok from Pokemon, XLR, 8, and even the Colgate 360 toothbrush with cheek and tongue cleaner.
It must be the version with the cheek and tongue cleaner.
And it might seem strange to us or like a recent trend, but the truth is it's not. Because this attraction that humans can feel toward a fictional character who isn't human or even from the animal kingdom. We've seen this before with characters like Judy Hobbs, Nick Wilde, and Lola Bunny from Space Jam in the 90s. Mythological stories and European folklore also mention similar things, which tells us that these cakes only highlight something that has existed for a long time. But here the question is, why? Why do we find all these characters attractive when many of them aren't even human? I researched the topic thoroughly and believe I have the answer. However, it's not simple, so let's start with some context. Chapter 1. A brief history of unconventional attraction. The key point is that stories about love or romance between humans and non-human characters are not new. A very old case can be found in the myth of King Minos, who once refused to sacrifice a sacred bull to honor Poseidon. Since the Greek gods were rarely vengeful, Poseidon made Minos' wife Pasiphae fall in love with the majestic bull, to the point of wanting to be intimate with him.
Consummate her relationship, yes.
Pasiphae did the doobie-doobie-doo with the bull, using a clever device invented by Daedalus. Yes, the same one who made Icarus's wings and disguised Pasiphae as a cow for the bull. This union resulted in the birth of the famous Minotaur of Crete, who would later be locked up in the labyrinth. We also see in Greek mythology that humans can fall in love with inanimate objects, as in the myth of Pygmalion, a king who couldn't find a wife. He used his sculpting skills to create the perfect woman and fell in love with her.
Who knew? Incest isn't new either.
At the story's end, Aphrodite grants life to Galatea, who later marries King Pygmalion. These two myths are ancient, but if you look closely, you can find elements from more recent stories in them. We could discuss Pinocchio or the movie Her, both of which use this narrative. Of a man who can't find a suitable partner among real women and ends up in a relationship with an artificially created woman. This shows that these stories contain the primitive seed that reveals relationships between humans and non-human beings. And as the years went by, we were shown more and more stories where we're told about the attraction of a human and something that isn't. Especially with monstrous beings that we gradually started to view more affectionately. A good example is Beauty and the Beast, where a young woman lives in a castle with a monstrous creature. She eventually learns to love someone for who they are, not just their appearance, which is key in the original story. The Beast is dying when Bella says she loves him, turning him into a handsome prince. Bella marries him and they live happily ever after. But Bella didn't know he was a prince. She was willing to love the Beast and didn't want to change him. This sets a strong precedent for stories where a woman falls for a monstrous figure. But the main goal is not to turn him into a man, but for him to keep that monstrosity. Another strong example is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which changed our view of monsters. Because here, unlike in older stories where monstrous figures had to be eradicated, just like the Minotaur, they describe a creature who suffers from rejection, longs to belong, and most of all, to be loved. So much so that in the novel, the creature asks Dr. Frankenstein to make him a partner, someone with whom he can share his life. In the latest version, shown in Guillermo del Toro's movie, they deepen the bond between the creature and the human woman, further reinforcing their relationship. All these stories are, in a way, narrative precedents that help us explain current phenomena like the cake. Hear me out! To truly understand the attraction between humans and non-humans, we must discuss the furry fandom free of myths, taboos, and prejudice. While reviewing sources for this video, I found research from an organization called Fur Science. Scientists and academics from various global universities dedicated themselves to studying the furry community phenomenon. From a scientific perspective, they have long provided reliable information on this topic and can help us better understand attraction to non-human characters. But let's start with the basics. Do you really know what a furry is? You may have heard about them, but there's much misinformation online. Here's the truth. According to the scientific community, the term furry describes a very diverse community of people who have a fascination with anthropomorphic animals, that is, animals with human characteristics. Most people within this community create a character called a fursona, which works as a kind of avatar they identify with and use to interact within the fandom. Some express this through cosplay with elaborate fursuits, while others just wear ears, tails, or represent their fursona in virtual communities like Second Life. But be careful, because many people think this is a fetish or that it has something to do with something sexual. But according to the data, only about 5 to 10% of the furry community sees this as a fetish. Studies show the most important thing for most furries is community, yet the furry community has still faced many attacks. In Texas, the so-called furry law was enacted to ban costumes and animal-themed behavior, like barking, meowing, or using a litter box for your needs in Texas schools. But the problem is that the very people who wrote this law weren't able to name a single school where this has happened.
Can you name a school that has confirmed giving students litter boxes for this? I can't.
I can't. This shows they made a law for a non-existent problem. And a lot of people who shared this news have a mistaken idea of what the furry community really is, an idea that comes from internet prejudice. Furries can be attracted to anthropomorphic characters, but think of them like any other fandom. If you hang out with gamers, otakus, or superhero fans, you've probably seen that each of these fandoms has its waifus and husbandos, their favorite characters, the ones they ship, the ones they sexualize, and the ones many fans want to be with. And in the furry community, something similar happens. But if you notice, there's a big difference between what we see with furries and what we saw in the story of Pasiphae and the Bull of Crete. In the Greek myth, Pasiphae literally falls in love with a bull, an animal. And therefore, the result of this union is something monstrous that must be hidden, the Minotaur. But it's different with characters like Lola Bunny, Judy Hopps, and Nick Wilde. Because what makes us find these characters attractive is that they have several human traits that we culturally consider attractive. What are those traits? I interviewed expert Fatima Del Rio, known as Mundara online, who has a degree in illustration and concept art, to clarify everything. And currently, she mainly works on creating 2D animation avatars for streamers and VTubers. But as you can see, there's a central theme in her work since most of her characters are furries.
Yes, that's definitely what I've decided to dedicate myself to. In my case, I've always liked drawing animals, and eventually I found what the furry community is. So yes, in general, I love working with this kind of characters, and that's what I've decided to dedicate myself to full time.
It turns out that people who work in illustration, like Mundara, have the ability to convey a lot of information using only visual elements. Each character's visual appearance tells a story, even if you know nothing about them or their background. So you, as a viewer, can infer the characteristics of each of these characters just by looking at them. This has to do with something called concept art.
Concept art has to do with creating a visual identity for a production. This could be a series, movies, video games, or personal projects. It's not just about making things look nice, but about what we want to communicate.
This means that the purpose of each of these famous movie scenarios is not just to look good on screen, but to give us information and reinforce the story's narrative. Now let's look at this from the character's side. Look at these three characters. Even if you don't know them, you can likely guess which is friendliest, strongest, or most dangerous. But how do you know that? It relates to the language of shapes.
Everything we put into a character, from the smallest line, communicates something to the viewer. So, when designing a character, you have to think, what is it that I want to communicate?
And once you know what you want to communicate, you use various techniques and specialized knowledge to get that message across to us.
Characters with rounder shapes communicate kindness to us, they communicate tenderness. If we go with triangular shapes, these are usually used, for example, for villains. They tell us about a more aggressive character. If we use a shape, for example, a square, it tells us about a more structured, more rigid character.
This is just one of the ways that artists and illustrators can give us a lot of information about a character. But if you notice, it's super effective. They make us feel familiar with these characters even if we've never seen them before. Can you guess which type Mundara gets asked for most?
I would say the most common ones are the flirty ones. It's something very common within the furry community.
But here's where it gets interesting. How does she use design to create a character that's flirty or attractive?
The eyes, for example, communicate the most. Personally, I like to add an expression that's kind of in between, where the eyes are a little half closed and the eyebrows are curved. Something that helps me a lot is looking for expressions from real-life people. Even when I'm drawing animals, I use these photos as a reference for how a person expresses these kinds of emotions. What muscles are being used in the face? What position do the eyes use in the eyebrows? I feel like the eyes and eyebrows are the most important.
These are the techniques that Mundara applies to his designs. I suppose other illustrators have their own, but pay attention to something very important he mentioned in his case. She uses references of human gestures and looks that we can consider attractive, and she implements them in anthropomorphic animals. Which tells us that part of what we find attractive about all these characters has to do precisely with the human characteristics that we already find attractive in our daily lives. How can it be a look, physical proportions, or even an attitude or way of speaking? However, men and women are attracted to different characteristics. By the way, today, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's free. You just have to click the little button. And honestly, that really helps us a lot. But anyway, let's continue with the topic, Chapter 3. What men and women want. When you ask us men, what strange or peculiar taste do we have? We often mention characters with traditional beauty like Nani, Elastigirl, or various anime waifus. But when you ask women, the answers are usually very diverse. There are many anime husbandos like Levi, but some people also mention the green rough spirit, the steed, untamable Pablo from the Backyardigans, or even the Colgate 360 toothbrush with cheek and tongue cleaner. I recently asked this in my stories, and those were basically the answers I got. Honorable mention to the person whose crush was the xenomorph queen. That's another level, man. But why does that happen? Evolutionary psychology suggests men and women generally value different traits in attraction, though these are just tendencies, not universal. For example, social psychologist David Booth says men are generally more attracted to physical signs of youth, health, and fertility, such as eyes, hips, and lips. These traits are evident in characters like Lola Bunny and Jessica Rabbit. Women are often attracted to traits beyond looks, like social and economic status, intelligence, charisma, attitude, or presence. So if you like Pablo, maybe it's because of his kindness and companionship. If you like Bambi's dad, maybe it's because in real life you like people who command a certain respect. And what if you like the queen? Xenomorph? I'm not sure what to say, but I'm sure there's something about her you like in real people. What could it be? This? It's something we don't just see through cakes. Hear me out. But we can also see it in the number of stories we have where women fall in love with monsters. Think about this. Have you noticed how many stories involve a woman falling in love with a monster? Stories where the main character understands, humanizes, and accepts the monstrous figure just as it is. There's a reason for this. Women are often taught to be empathetic and caring, so in many stories they understand the monstrous figure beyond its appearance. And we're presented with a narrative of emotional transformation, where the monster, despite being dangerous to others, chooses not to be a threat to them. So the woman then ends up taming the creature in a certain way, but without changing its monstrous characteristics. In stories with male monsters, things tend to be different than in stories with female monsters, since female monsters often retain certain aesthetic features that we consider human and desirable. Also, in many cases, the goal is for the monster to stop being a monster. This also tells us how men and women understand desire and attraction in different ways. Since stories about male monsters usually focus on acceptance and recognizing the vulnerability that exists beyond their appearance. Whereas in stories with female monsters, the narrative tends to seek correction. Which tells us that, at least in stories, women can love the monstrous, something that definitely in the real world can have negative consequences, but men rarely desire that. If you want to learn more, Adora Rodriguez has a helpful video essay on this topic that aided my research. Remember, these are trends, not absolutes, and they are always changing. A recent study found that women are less interested in seeking partners with greater economic resources, and it suggests that this might be because Western culture is changing. So now, both men and women work, and surely in the coming decades we'll see many more changes in what men and women find attractive. Interestingly, companies like Disney know our taste for these characters. And clearly Judy Hopps and Nick Wilde are designed in such a way that they appeal to the particular tastes of men and women. For example, Hobbs has pronounced curves, and Nick has the arrogant attitude many women find attractive. So much so that in 2016, when the first part of Zootopia was released, it was revealed that Disney teamed up with furry organizations to plan the marketing of the film. This shows they always knew the movie would be a big success in this community. And not to mention the trailer for Zootopia 2 where they show Nick in a very flirty outfit, which is pure fan service. This shows that human desire is more complex than we often assume. We don't always have conventional or typically aesthetic tastes, and we definitely all have a preference that others might consider strange. If we think about it, we like something about each character. Something that often goes beyond the physical. It could be an attitude, a certain physical trait, the way they respond to problems, or many other qualities. And yes, we usually talk about trends. But remember that each of us is an individual, and for that reason, there are many things we can find attractive that aren't always the norm. These characters resonate with our specific desires and longings. It's worth remembering then that each of us has a taste that's a bit unconventional. And for that reason, I also think it's worth being tolerant of other people's tastes. And remember that we live in a world that's much more diverse than we usually think. If you're new to the channel and made it this far, let me tell you that I make video essays about pop culture, so if you like this content, you'd really help me out by subscribing. I'll also leave you some other videos here that you might like. Check them out. That's all for today. I'm Gio the Geek Monitor, and keep looking beyond the obvious.